Now I have the pleasure of introducing today's always engaging presenters. First, we have John Elmerode, who's joining us from Virginia. John is an associate professor and executive director of teaching and learning in the College of Education at James Madison University. He works with pre-service teachers and actively pursues his research interests. He and his colleagues have presented their work to the United States Congress, the Department of Education, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. John has authored multiple articles, reports, and books, including Clarity for Learning, the Success Criteria Playbook, and the upcoming Quick Guide to Simultaneous, Hybrid, and Blended Learning. Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry are joining us today from Southern California. And Doug and Nancy are both professors of educational leadership at San Diego State University and leaders at Health Sciences High and Middle College. Doug has served as a teacher, language development specialist, and administrator in public schools and nonprofit organizations. And Nancy has been a special education teacher, a reading specialist, and an administrator in public schools. Doug and Nancy have engaged in professional learning communities for several decades, building teams that design and implement systems to impact teaching and learning. And they've published numerous books, including the Teacher Clarity Playbook, the PLC series, and the Distance Learning Playbook series. Kateri Thunder is also joining us from Virginia, and she has served as an inclusive early childhood educator, an upward bound educator, a mathematics specialist, an assistant professor of mathematics education at James Madison University, and site director of the Central Virginia Writing Project. Kateri is an author on the Corwin Visible Learning for Mathematics series, a member of NCTM's research committee, and co-creator of the Math Diet. Currently, Kateri has followed her passion back to the classroom, and she's teaching pre-kindergarten, serving as the pre-K4 math lead for Charlottesville City Schools, and she works as an educational consultant. So let's get started with John, and he'll start us off with our learning intentions for today.
All right. Hey, hello, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. The four of us are so excited to talk to you about success criteria. In other words, we're going to take teacher clarity and we're going to drill down to the idea of establishing, creating, and then implementing criteria for success. And so that's going to be our focus. We together are going to learn about the role of success criteria in maximizing student learning. This is a big, big topic because if you go to the Visible Learning Database, MetaX, and I'm going to put that in the chat box right now, Visible Learning MetaX, you can visit that anytime you would like. You will see that that particular influence has the potential to more than double the rate of learning. It has an effect size of about 0.88. But you notice I used the word potential. Just because the research says the effect size is 0.88, it doesn't mean I can just plop down success criteria and go on about my work. The potential reflects the potential impact it can have, but we have to implement it. We have to make decisions about that implementation. And that's really going to be our focus this evening. Not just that success criteria work, but what do we need to think about and consider in the implementation of success criteria to take that potential and turn it into impact. And so that brings us to our success criteria. Take a look. And so in the chat box, if you would just take a quick moment and let's do a quick pre-assessment. Where are we in terms of defining success criteria? If you had to sum up success criteria in your own words right now, right off the bat, what would it be? Throw that in the chat box. Take a quick second. Throw in what you believe success criteria are or aren't in the chat box. Quickly, what do you think? Absolutely. Wow. So keeping up with all those chats is going to be something. And so if you are overstimulated, don't worry about that. Let the ticker tape move on through. And for those of you that know what ticker tape is, congratulations, you just dated yourself. So let's look at why we need success criteria and the whole concept behind this. The four statements you see on the screen reflect learning intentions, and I apologize for the barking dog. That's just the way it is at our house, and it's the COVID fallout. So notice the four statements on the screen. Those are rather strong statements that are associated with our core standards in science, mathematics, language arts, and social studies. In other words, part of the mathematical processes or practices involve constructing an argument. The science and engineering practices for the NGSS involve gathering and compelling scientific evidence. What does it mean to be an active reader is the use of text features. And then finally, a historical thinker compares two historical accounts of the same event. My question, though, is that what does it really mean to successfully construct an argument, gather evidence, use text features, or compare historical accounts? In other words, these statements in and of themselves aren't enough. There needs to be more than just construct a viable mathematical argument. There has to be other intermediaries or things that happen in between that allow learners to really, truly see how their learning progression is moving. And that's one of the reasons we decided to move forward with success criteria as a topic for further investigation. We noticed learners were very good at talking about what they learned and even why they were learning it. But when we got into big ideas, when we got into complex learning, simply listing an I can statement didn't seem like it had been enough. And so we had to reframe how we thought about success criteria and talk about that implementation. In other words, we were seeing situations in classrooms where the potential for doubling the rate of learning wasn't ever brought to actualization. So there are four main characteristics of success criteria that I'd like to share with you that we're going to then explore further on later on in this webinar. Number one, success criteria define the pathways learners take to meet the learning intention. So in the chat box, if you would, please type in the word define. Word define. And so when we talk about using text features, when we talk about comparing historical documents, when we talk about gathering evidence, constructing an argument, success criteria should define what that looks like. In other words, what are the ingredients necessary for the learner to bring together that would represent that learning intention? So success criteria define that pathway. Now, I have to tell you, and I don't think it's lost on this crowd, but just in case, I want to point it out for my own gratification here. The path doesn't have to be easy. So if you look at the path on the screen, that picture was intentional. Defining the path to the learning intention doesn't mean we make it easy. It can still be bumpy. It can still be curvy. There can still be unexpected components. But at the end of the day, there is definition about how to move forward in the learning. But it doesn't take away that productive struggle. Another key feature of success criteria is that it includes, or they include, multiple steps that lead to that successful learning. In other words, we don't just define it, but we define it in the form of a progression, so to speak. And again, that progression doesn't have to be easy, but the progression has to be clear, that these are the components that lead to successful learning. It can't be a one-and-done statement. It can't be just a thing. It has to be a step of things that lead to that learning intention. And so the question that Lisa asked, and I love it, and Doug jumped right on that, can there be more than one pathway to begin with? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. And although we won't necessarily get into that tonight, one of the things that we talk about is if we clearly build steps and if we clearly define that path, right? So we take those two things, and I'm going to go off script for a second. Let's say one of the success criteria is I can compare and contrast a quality mathematical argument and one that is not of high quality, or I can identify evidence in science and information that doesn't count as evidence in science. Identify, describe, relate, those verbs. There are lots of different ways kids can describe. There are lots of different ways kids can identify. So we can give them different pathways to get to that same level of complexity. And you're exactly right. Cognitive task analysis is a great way to determine success criteria. So again, if your success criteria is I can describe, how many different ways can learners describe? Those are those different pathways. A third characteristic of success criteria is that they should be measurable and should reflect a way for us to progress monitor. So if my learning intention is the target and the success criteria define it and pave out the way to get there, they should be written and constructed in a way that inform our assessments, they inform our tasks, they inform our strategies and approaches, but it allows us to monitor that progress. In other words, they should be observable and measurable in such a way that we can monitor the progress of our learners and they can then ultimately monitor their own progress. Those success criteria should lead to self-regulation, self-reflecting, self-monitoring, and then ultimately self-evaluation. So I want to add 2 words to the chat box before we wrap up this segment. Multiple steps needs to go into the chat box. So if you would type in multiple steps. I just like seeing the chat move that quickly. And you can probably guess the words we'd like to put in here for the last statement, and that is monitor progress. We want to make sure monitor progress gets into that chat box. This is cracking me up. I've never done this before where I've had this much response in a chat box. So let's look at an example of this. I'm going to show you a video that has some age on it. And if you've been to any webinars and been to any institutes, you'll likely recognize this video. It is not a new video, and I just want to be upfront. It is not a new video. But what we see happening in this video is incredibly linked to what we're talking about tonight, which means these are things that we have done in our classrooms for years. Now we're talking tonight about doing it with intention and with purpose. I want you to meet Sarah, and I want you to watch Sarah interact with success criteria and how it defines, allows her to monitor her progress, and shows steps towards that learning intention. Let's meet Sarah.
Sarah, can you tell us how this chart works? We'll point to them and tell us about it.
I know nobody's on this, but some people may not be on this.
How come?
Because some people won't do that because we're in kindergarten, but some people might do that.
Good. Now go further up the chart and tell us about the middle of it, Sarah, around the orange crayon.
Well, some people sound it out and try and make their letters neat on this one.
Good. And what about further up the chart, Sarah? Then what happens?
On this one, they try to sound it out. They try to make their letters neatly and try to make the thing right. This is where I am. I sound it out. I try to keep them nicely written. I try to make the right words. I try to keep the letters with a space before they start. And I'm going over to here because it's the last step and I'm over at the 9 step. This is the 10 step.
Now, Christina, the fact you still have that border is awesome. And so you should win a free book on that alone. The other thing, some of you are asking about rubrics. Now, hang tight, we're not there yet, but it does bring us to our final major characteristic of a success criteria, right? It actually helps students answer the question, how will I know that I have learned it? In other words, not only should it be multiple steps, not only should it be a pathway, and not only should it allow us to monitor our progress, but it should in the end let students have a clear picture, a clear idea of what successful learning looks like. But understand, we don't mean to imply that learning has an end point. The learning is going to continue, but it's the guideposts along that learning progression that tells me, okay, I've got this. Okay, I've got this. Okay, I've got this. And to keep moving forward in that learning. So those are the 4 major characteristics of success criteria that allow us to take a statement like identify compelling evidence, use text features, compare historical documents, and unpack it in such a way that it's no longer an abstract idea, but it is a clear pathway that allows me to get to that learning. So we're going to pause for a minute and let's go back to the chat. Oh, I love that. The chat box is great. Some great questions. Let's go to our chat for this. In the beginning, you were asked to define success criteria as a form of pre-assessment. Now that we've talked a little bit about success criteria, what is your new definition? What is your new definition? How do you piece this all together and make sense of those characteristics? And certainly watching little Sarah. Take a moment. How would you define it now? Excellent. Ownership, metacognition, progressions, multiple pathways, steps, absolutely. Student friendly, excellent responses. And so that's the first part. And what we're going to do now is spend a little bit of time talking about the next component of this. And for that, I'm going to kick it over to my partners in crime, Kateri and Doug and Nancy. Take it away. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm having a little moment with my screen share. All right, so you've got where we are with the big idea of success criteria and how success criteria is defining that pathway. And sometimes I find it really helpful for me to see some non-examples. So what are some common challenges or non-examples? So let's see if this will share and we'll be ready to roll. All right, here we go. All right, so we're thinking back to those learning intentions that John shared with us at the beginning, the 4 kind of big areas of math, science, literacy, and history. When you're setting your learning intentions and success criteria, you're thinking about that big question of what do you want those learners to say and do if they've truly mastered that learning intention. So that's defining that pathway, the multiple steps that make that progression, progress monitoring, and how will you know that they've learned it? Being able to answer that question as the teacher and being able to answer that question as the learner. And as some people said, being open with our language is important so that students have some choice and some voice in that. Allowing for a productive struggle is really important so we don't take that away with our success criteria. But when we're aiming for that, sometimes we come across some challenges and we make success criteria that actually are non-examples. They actually kind of muddy the water or aren't clear enough. So let's look at some of those common challenges. So here's the first one. When you're making your learning intention and making your success criteria, you can start by answering these 3 questions. So what am I learning? I'm learning about solving systems of equations. Why am I learning this? So I can solve systems of equations. How will I know I've learned it? This is your success criteria when I can solve systems of equations. So that one is a really circular pathway, circular logic to creating that success criteria. And it doesn't add to learners or teachers' understanding of what it means to be successful, of actually learning the mastery of that learning intention. It kind of just confuses things and makes it the circular logic that doesn't help to bring clarity. So here's another example of this circular logic in creating success criteria, but in literacy. So I'm learning to ask and answer questions about details in a text. Why? So I can ask and answer about details in a text. And how will I know? When I can ask and answer about details in a text. So there it is, that circular idea. And you may have experienced that, where you're trying to think through and somehow you end up with a replication of what I'm learning with how will I know I've learned it. So we're going to try to avoid that when we're creating our success criteria. Another common challenge is that our success criteria becomes really procedural. And so there may be a procedural aspect, some procedural knowledge that you want your learners to gain in order to accomplish that learning intention, but it shouldn't be just procedural, so narrow and so tight that just getting to a right answer is their goal. So here's an example of this 2 procedural success criteria. First, the learning intention. I'm learning about our solar system. Why? So that I can understand my place in the universe. How will I know I've learned it? I can name the 8 planets. I can list them in order from closest to farthest from the sun. That's really procedural. And so there needs to be something bigger, something that aligns with the concepts that relate to thinking about the solar system, something that relates to application of those concepts, perhaps dispositions around being a scientist and learning about the solar system, and perhaps something collaborative, right? Because as scientists and as learners, we're often collaborating. Here's another example of a 2 procedural success criteria. So I'm learning to locate land claimed by Spain, France, England, Portugal, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Russia. Why? So that I can understand the development of the Americas after European contact and conquest. And how will I know I learned it? When I can name the location claimed by each country. So kind of ticking off that list. And that gets really procedural, and it becomes focusing learners just on getting a right answer instead of thinking about those concepts and dispositions and bigger ideas. So it's okay when you're making your success criteria to have some procedural knowledge, but creating that procedural knowledge as the only thing you want them to know, that kind of gets us into too narrow of thinking, where there is not that opportunity for openness with choice and voice. A third challenge that we have when we make success criteria is when there is, when we're looking at it and we kind of use some really broad words, things that make it too abstract, or perhaps we put like a qualifying word in there that kind of make it unclear what it would actually look like to accomplish that. So here's an example from science. The learning intention is, what am I learning? I'm learning that the analysis of weather data is used to predict weather events. Why am I learning this? So that I can better understand how weather events impact ecosystems. How will I know I learned it? So this is that success criteria. When I can thoroughly analyze weather data, when I can make the best weather predictions for a given area. So take a look at that success criteria for that third question, the how will I know? Can you see the part where you think, I couldn't measure that. I couldn't say I have thoroughly analyzed weather data. What does thoroughly analyzing weather data look like? When I make the best weather prediction for a given area, well, what is the best weather prediction? So those kind of qualifiers really throw you off from being able to be clear and measurable about what it means to reach that success criteria. And here's one more example, a math one. I am learning about the relationships between angles formed by 2 lines intersected by a transversal. Why? So that I can prove the 2 lines are parallel. Here's that success criteria. How will I know? When I can reason quantitatively and when I can engage in critical thinking. Now, I love math, and those speak to me, right? I want my students to reason quantitatively, and I want them to engage in critical thinking, but what does that actually look like? As the teacher, how will I know that a student has reasoned quantitatively and engaged in critical thinking? What am I going to name that they did? And as the learner, what does that mean, right? I maybe have never even heard of those words before. So making sure that success criteria is measurable is a really important part of being clear in defining that pathway and being able to use success criteria for progress monitoring. All right, so we looked at 3 challenges that we've seen, right? So making success criteria that's perhaps not measurable, making it circular, and then making it too procedural. What are some challenges that you've experienced when you've been creating and implementing success criteria? Will you pop those into the chat? As you're adding things into the chat about challenges you've faced, there's a question about making success criteria procedural if you're still thinking about those lower level building block skills. So I currently teach pre-K, and I do not make my success criteria primarily procedural, right? And so I still want my students to think about collaborating. I still want them to think about the language they're using and the concepts they're learning. And I still want them to be grasping towards those big ideas and grappling with them. And so creating success criteria that they can understand is really important. Being able to see success criteria, and we're going to get into this in the next part. How do you communicate that to students? That's one way. That's really important to make sure that success criteria is clear, but communicating it doesn't mean that success criteria is dumbed down or made just procedural. So there's ways to communicate it to make sure that even our youngest learners or learners who aren't reading yet or learners who don't speak English fluently can understand that success criteria. And we're going to move into that next. All right, I'm going to pass it over. I love the things that you're adding into the chat.
And Kateri, what you had to offer is so important. It's really serving as the bridge between just having success criteria posted and communicating it. That's really a key to making success criteria clear for students. We have to be able to communicate that, to take that to the next level. So there's also consideration around how it is that students are going to experience that kind of success criteria. And there are a number of different ways that this gets communicated. The first being the use of those I can statements. This is a very popular approach for lots of teachers to be able to use, especially because it helps students to actually be able to cognitively restructure what it is that they're going to be learning about. There's a priming effect that happens there by stating positively that I can do this. Think about the goals that you set for yourself, and those I can self-talk statements end up being an important part of this. Teachers utilize those I can statements, but they also add lots of language to it as well. They don't just post it somewhere on a board or on a learning management system and hope for the best. They're actually parsing it. Let's listen to a history teacher talk about his I can statements.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This week, we're going to dive into Unit 3. We're going to look at women's history. We're going to take a look at some of the significant achievements that they were able to achieve in the late 1800s and early 1900s. As always, we like to start you with some learning intentions so you can understand what it is that we're learning. We're going to start with content, understand the significant achievement of women's suffrage in the early 1920s. For our language purpose, we want you to describe the actions and techniques that were deployed by women groups that led to political reform or change with the eventual passing of the 19th Amendment. As always, for our social purpose, we want you to maintain a respectful discourse. We want you to be respectful while engaging in conversations with your peers, and we want you to collaborate with one another. Next, we're going to take a look at success criteria. We want you to be able to self-assess and understand where you are at in your learning. So we have a few I can statements. The first one is I can identify the meaning of women's suffrage. Once you know what that means, you will check this off, meaning that you already understand it. Next, I can describe blank number of tactics that were used to convince the American government that change was necessary. We're going to look at a lot of them. There's going to be various tactics that were deployed, and so I want you to tell me how many of them you know. Next, I can explain the significance of the 19th Amendment. I want you to tell me what it did for women's rights and why it's so important in our nation. Lastly, I can summarize the significance of women's suffrage. This will be a little bit towards the end of the unit. You'll be able to fully describe the impact that women's suffrage had on an American political system.
I hope that what you heard is how it was that the teacher built out that success criteria. It wasn't just, oh, I'm going to put this on the PowerPoint and let them all read it and hopefully absorb it or not. He's parsing it, he's taking it apart, and he's elaborating on that as well. Success criteria need to be something that is alive in the classroom, not just wallpaper. And another way of doing so is to be able to identify rubrics and how it is that rubrics are used. Doug, do you have anything that you'd like to say about rubrics as we go into this next section?
Sure. And I think in San Diego, we got so enamored with I can statements that we forgot there were other ways to let students know what success looked like. I mean, we got heavy into I can statements, and we actually got really good at them. But sometimes in some content, they just aren't appropriate. There are other ways to describe success. And there are different kinds of rubrics that we can use to do that. Holistic rubrics, analytic rubrics, and single point rubrics also help students know what success means. So we want to be clear that the goal is that students know what success looks like. The tools that we have at our disposal are many, including, as I'm seeing in the chat, students co-constructing success criteria with their teachers. We'll get there. Here's an example from mathematics, single point rubric, but this teacher put I can statements inside the single point rubric. And notice that the teacher says, where, self-assess, where are you still needing to grow? And where are your glows? What are you really good at?
And here's a different example, and this one is from a drama class as well. One thing that you may consider doing is taking one of your favorite rubrics that you're currently using, analytic or holistic one, and turning it into a single point rubric. Isolate on that column that suggests what proficiency looks like, move that to the center and call that your success criteria. And then, as Doug was saying, invite students to be able to also self-assess. How am I doing on this? Where are those places that I can grow? And what are some glows that I'm already noticing?
Nancy, we're seeing some new language on single point writing rubrics. The challenge with I can statements and writing is that you might create really formulaic writing. By having just, I can this, I can this, I can this. So we started seeing a new one in writing where it says, what can I refine and where am I shining? So refines and shines became more common in the work on writing. So what are the indicators that you've impacted the audience? Where do you need to refine and where are you shining?
And I'm seeing a question in the chat as well. So we don't literally have a rubric for every single lesson and so on, but rather, especially when you're thinking about some of those more long-ranging projects that students are doing. For example, here's a lab report rubric in chemistry. Isolate in on that meet or exceed expectations, that fourth column over there on the right, and turn that into your success criteria.
You can also use a holistic rubric, but this is kind of like success criteria for on a single point rubric. There's just different levels of success. What level of success do you want to achieve on this holistic rubric? See, all these rubrics help students internalize what success looks like. And any of us who've used rubrics over the years, we may not have been as intentional and consciously aware, but when we spent time with our students talking about the rubric, what was in the rubric in advance of the instruction, not using the rubric after as a gotcha, we were actually getting students to understand what success looks like.
So the use of rubrics, another great way to be able to communicate success criteria, especially for those more long-term projects that are going on. Here's another way to think about how it is that you communicate those success criteria. And that's through modeling. Yes, teacher modeling is an important way in which we help students to be able to see what it is that success looks like. Teacher modeling can be a really important lever for students to be able to see our thinking. Keep in mind that thinking is invisible, right? And the cognition that needs to go into many of the success criteria really do demand that we do some thinking aloud. Let's take a look at a primary teacher who is doing some modeling around success criteria in writing for her young students.
Good morning, everyone. The last few days, we've been reading lots of informational text on mammals. We've filled up our brains with lots of key details and cool facts about different kinds of animals. And today we want to share our learning by writing an informational piece about a mammal. So before we do our writing, though, we have to talk about how we organize our thinking. We organize our thinking so that our writing will be clear for the person that is reading it. And so the very first thing that we're going to learn about is how to write a topic sentence. Let's look at our learning intention for today. Our learning intention is, I am learning how to introduce a topic by writing a topic sentence. Topic sentence. Boys and girls, what a topic sentence is that one super important sentence that tells the reader what the main idea about our writing is. We don't ever want our reader to be confused about what our writing is, and we're certainly not just going to list a bunch of facts in our writing. So we're going to organize it in a way that the reader makes sense of it. And the best way to do that is by writing a really strong topic sentence to tell them what they're going to be reading about. Here's our success criteria. I know I have done this when the reader knows what my writing is about after reading my topic sentence. So boys and girls, yesterday we read that book on bats and we pulled out lots of key details. I went ahead and wrote some of the key details that you learned about. And here are some of the things that you said were interesting about bats. They're flying mammals. They eat insects, fruit, and fish. They're nocturnal. We learned what that word meant. And they use echolocation. Remember, echolocation is how they use sound waves to see where predators are and how to catch their food. So I want to put this in a paragraph to teach others about bats. But let's think about what my topic sentence is going to be. Remember that a topic sentence tells our reader what they're going to be reading about. So if I want my reader to know that they're going to be learning about bats, my topic sentence might not necessarily give all these facts, but just introduce the main idea to my reader. Let me think about this. I think I'm going to write, there are lots of interesting things to know about bats. Right? Read that again. There are lots of interesting things to know about bats. When I look at that sentence, boys and girls, I want it to give my reader a clue as to what the rest of my writing is going to be. The rest of my writing is going to have sentences that include these cool facts and key details that we pulled from the book, but we want to make sure to start it off with a sentence that they know what they're going to be reading about. So let's read it one more time together. There are lots of interesting things to know about bats. Let's go back and look at our success criteria. I know I have done this when the reader knows what my writing is about after reading my topic sentence. I think if somebody reads this sentence, they will surely know that the topic of my writing is going to be bats. So boys and girls, I want you to pick a mammal and we're going to work on writing a topic sentence for the rest of our writing.
I want to put a pause on that too. First of all, Doug and I totally agree. Hilda is a brilliant teacher, but what she did right there at the end, that is what makes that success criteria really come to life. Keep in mind that her learning intention, we're learning how to write a topic sentence, but who cares? Who cares about a topic sentence? The success criteria are communicating that. I will know that I've written a good topic sentence because when my reader knows what will be coming next. She then models a topic sentence and then goes back to that success criteria again to look at that, to do that checking along the way. That's exactly what it is that we want students to be able to do, to have that success criteria really live within their learning, and not just, as many of you noted, not just to be the wallpaper.
In this case, Nancy, as brilliant as Hilda has been our entire lives together, as I see Kathy's comment, the success criteria as it's written is not the strength of the lesson. It's the modeling and the thinking aloud and the connection back. That's how I believe her students knew what success looked like. If she just did the success criteria and then went on with the lesson, I'm not sure they would actually know, oh, that's what it looks like.
Another way that you can communicate that success criteria, we've talked about I can statements, we've talked about modeling, and a third way, rubrics rather, modeling, and a fourth way is using exemplars. All of us have examples that we can draw upon, that we can use in order to be able to use that as modeling. Doug and I both like to use exemplars that are almost there but not quite, so that we can engage students in those conversations about how they might advise that writer, that learner, to be able to elevate their learning. Let's take a look at a high school English teacher, again using a student exemplar in order to be able to help her students know about what this successful essay assignment is going to look like.
So we're going to look at a model student paper today, the introduction specifically, to see if we can get some ideas about how we might make our own introduction for this argumentative paper, Why I Hate ... So remember, your task is to think of something like a cultural icon that most people really love, and you need to make an argument for why you really don't like this thing. So we want to make sure that our introductions are not only introducing the icon, the film, the person that you are that you're going to be writing about, but we also want to see your thesis statement. So let's turn our attention to this sample and see if we can't get a little bit of insight into what might be a good way to start our own paper. So the title says it all, and you don't need to do a title this direct. You might want to be a bit more provocative, a bit more interesting, get your reader thinking. This writer wanted to get straight to the point. Why I Hate The Little Mermaid. Okay, so we already know what we're going to be looking for. I love The Little Mermaid, so I'm really going to be curious as to why this person does not like one of my favorite Disney films. So they write, no other company has managed to package and sell childhood memories like Disney. While today they remain a corporate Goliath, Disney was once a simple animation studio which specialized in retelling folk fairy tales. All right, so they have hooked my attention already. Again, I love Disney, I love The Little Mermaid. I'm definitely intrigued because they are basically telling me that my childhood memories, my love of The Little Mermaid is a packaged and sold thing. So when you write your own paper, you might want to think about who you're writing to, but also how you might get their attention, because it is different for every reader. So starting with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, released in 1938 and continuing into the modern age with the great popularity of Frozen, another animated film based on the Snow Queen. So they're going through some of the background of Disney. Again, you'll want to give some context as well in your paper, because your reader might not be familiar with the cultural icon that you are going to be talking about. Typically, these tales detail a distressed damsel who is eventually saved by a prince, although these tales have slowly shifted to portray independent female protagonists solving their own issues. Given the time of their premiere, the older Disney films typically carry outdated ideals, and as such, I typically find them to be somewhat problematic, but I have learned to contextualize them and understand that challenging the normal gender standards of the 1900s would not be profitable. So I want to pause here. Our writer has done a couple of things. They've caught our attention, again, because they understand the reader. They know that I might have a different view of Disney than they do. They've given me a little bit of background into typically what their films are about in this genre. So they mentioned Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which was the first Disney film. And then they go all the way up to the present with Frozen. I'm familiar with both of those. And essentially they're starting to build their argument. Like, hey, these kind of have the same organization. It's always a woman in distress that needs somebody to save her. So you're gonna also at some point in your paper, after you introduce your topic, and I want you to think about this. This is not a very long introduction. So the author knows that she can go into more detail as the paper goes on, but she's giving me a little bit of a taste of what she might argue. So now I'm getting a sense that she doesn't like the damsel in distress part. However, it's not really worth it to look at Snow White, for example, because that was made in a time where damsel in distress was a typical trope and it was part of the way society was organized.
I'll put a pause on that. Using another student's work to be able to kind of talk through what it is that you're noticing, what it is that you're observing can be really useful for students. And her exemplar that she used went on for several more minutes after that. I am sorry for those of you that love The Little Mermaid and found that paper to be somewhat distressing. But remember that the essay that they were writing was an argumentation essay. And the whole idea was take on something, take on a subject that most people would disagree with you about, and take that on, make that as a challenge.
And Kimberly says that she was totally sucked in, like she was right there, like, I'm going to write my paper. I got to get this. So, yes.
One final way to make sure that that communication is really well understood is, as several of you noted earlier, to co-construct success criteria with students. Oh, and by the way, Denise, that was 11th grade. To co-construct that success criteria. And this requires some experience on the part of students as well. Make sure that they're getting familiar with what success criteria are, how it is that they function, and so on. Great questions to ask oneself when co-constructing those, and these are questions that students can answer as well. Do my success criteria truly represent learning intentions for my learners? Many of you talked about the importance of using child-friendly language. Well, one of the great ways to use child-friendly language is to co-construct, to ask them, to have them use the language of children to be able to explain that. Another critical question to ask, did I pick the best option for implementing success criteria? And a third, am I using success criteria to support my students taking ownership of their learning? So one final chat for you, and that is this. What different approaches to success criteria do you find most helpful in making learning visible? What are ones that you really like to have?
Awesome. You know, Nancy, I don't think you said this, but you know, if we go back to the I can statements as they type in the chat, you came up with an idea several months ago of turning the I can statements to a can I statement and having students self-assess by saying, can I do this? And then the answer is, for some, is not yet. So they have less fear of failure of it when we say, ask yourself, can you do this? And if not, what do you need to do to get there? So I saw the chats about there are students out there who have fear of failure, but could we use success criteria to support them as a not yet can I do this?
I love seeing all of those ideas in the chat.
Awesome.
So we'll go back to our own success criteria that John set out for us at the beginning of this webinar, and that is this. Can I define success criteria. This is exactly what it was that Doug was talking about, moving from can I to self-assessments. Can I define success criteria? Can I describe some of the challenges that are associated with creating and implementing success criteria? Kateri especially talked about what some of those challenges are. And can I describe different approaches for implementing success criteria, including things like can I statements and I can statements rather, and rubrics and so on. We so appreciate the time that you have spent with us. And Dina, I want to make sure to hand this back to you because I know you have a few items to be able to offer.
Yeah, and you can just actually, if you don't mind, keep control of it and we'll just advance through there. So thank you so much to John and Kateri, to Nancy and Doug for giving so graciously of your time to make this event available to each of us. And thank you so much for all the educators who joined us and sharing a part of your day with us. We really appreciate all that you do. And just as a reminder, the webinar has been recorded. That recording, along with your certificate of attendance, will be sent to you via email in the next few days. And then you can also visit Corwin.com webinars to register for any upcoming webinars and to view archived webinars. And then we were going to announce now the winners of the book drawing. And so if these two people would please chat your email addresses to us when I announce your names, or you can email us at info@corwin.com and let us know that you were one of the winners, and we'll send out your success criteria playbook. So today's randomly drawn winners are Wendy Olson and Timothy Tibbs. So if Wendy and Timothy will chat us your email addresses or send us an email at info@corwin.com. And for everyone else, you do have a promo code webinars, which will give you not only the 20% off at Corwin.com, but also free shipping on the success criteria playbook.
Dina, I just have to interrupt you there. Timothy Tibbs used to work with us at our school as a history teacher before he went to the Peace Corps. That is amazing. 1,000 people on, and he wins. So cool.
Like I said, totally random. That's amazing. So congratulations. That's wonderful. And then going on to the next slide, if you'd like to do a deeper dive into success criteria and teacher clarity, Corwin does offer full-day institutes. And under the guidance of today's presenters, institute participants will engage in active and empowering learning experiences. So to learn more about our institutes or to register for them, go to corwin.com/TCP, as in Teacher Clarity Playbook Institutes, to look up the information on those institutes. And so once again, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and week. And again, we appreciate all of you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. Thank you all. Stay safe. Thank you.